Did you know that the right to own a gun in America was not originally about hunting or even self-defense against criminals? It was about protecting yourself from your own government. The founders weren't vague about this, and today, that message might be more relevant than ever. What the Second Amendment actually says. So let's take a look at the words of the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Here's the thing. People love to debate whether that first part limits the second. But if you look at how the founders used language at the time, it's more like an explanation. The well-regulated militia is the reason the right exists, not the limit on it. And here's a fun fact. When they said well-regulated, they didn't mean controlled by the government. They meant well-functioning or properly trained, just like we say someone is well-regulated emotionally, not government-regulated. So why was this right so important to the founders? Well, the founders had just fought a war against the world's most powerful empire, Great Britain. They saw firsthand how governments use armies to silence opposition. That's why they distrusted standing armies and wanted power to stay decentralized. Alexander Hamilton said it best in Federalist Number 29, a trained, armed citizenry could eliminate the need for a massive permanent military. That is to say, if every community had its own defense, no single person or government could dominate. James Madison added that an armed populace was the ultimate check on federal power. He believed it created a barrier against the enterprises of ambition. In other words, tyrants beware. So this wasn't just a theory, it was based on history. What I mean by that is that this wasn't just political philosophy. The founders were students of history. They knew that disarmament was a key move for tyrants. For example, in England, King James II disarmed Protestants who opposed him while arming loyalists. In France, Cardinal Richelieu, I probably pronounced that wrong, forgive me, forced local lords to tear down their own castle walls and banned private militias. And even in ancient Rome, Julius Caesar's rise to dictatorship came after years of shifting military power away from the Senate and into loyal armies. The pattern is always the same. Disarm the people, centralize the power, crush the resistance. The founders were not paranoid. They were prepared. It wasn't until 2008 that the Supreme Court even made a major ruling on the Second Amendment. In District of Columbia versus Heller, the court ruled that the Second Amendment does protect an individual's right to own firearms, unconnected to service in a militia. Then, in McDonald versus City of Chicago, they said that that right applies to state and local governments too, not just the federal government. But even in these cases, the court was split 5-4. That means nearly half the justices believe the government could heavily restrict or ban private gun ownership. So even though it may be written clearly in the Constitution, this right is not guaranteed forever, which means it depends on interpretation, and the interpretation depends on who's in charge. Let's be real. Nobody thinks a group of citizens could take on the modern U.S. military in a head-to-head battle. While the populace outnumbers the military, the firepower does not. So some people may ask, what's the point of the Second Amendment today? Think about it this way. Tyranny doesn't always come with tanks and troops. It can come in the form of censorship, surveillance, overreach, and fear. It is incremental, not dramatic. And while guns alone will not stop a tyrannical system, they send a very clear message. The people still hold the power. Even today, countries that disarm their citizens tend to centralize control faster. Look at Venezuela. Look at Cuba. Look at North Korea. The right to bear arms does not guarantee freedom, but losing it can almost always guarantee you'll never get it back. Thomas Jefferson once said, "What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance?" During World War II, the Japanese considered not invading the U.S. mainland, partly because, as one general supposedly said, there would be a rifle behind every blade of grass. The Militia Acts of 1792 actually required able-bodied men to own a musket and supplies. Back then, gun ownership wasn't just a right, it was a civic duty. So when we talk about the Second Amendment today, we're not just talking about politics or policy. We're talking ultimately about a balance of power. We're talking about whether the government serves the people or the people serve the government. It was never just about guns. It was about freedom. And history shows us once that right is gone, it does not come back. What do you think the founders would say about today's debate over the Second Amendment? Drop your thoughts below.